here with Sam Kleinman, staff engineer working in distributed systems as part of RedMonk's Docs Are In series, where we talk about all things docs, from academic doctorates to documentation and technical communication more broadly. My name is Kate Holterhoff, Dr. Kate Holterhoff, analyst at RedMonk and documentation enthusiast. I brought Sam here today because he has a background as a technical writer and technical communication specialist. And so I want to just begin this conversation by having Sam tell us a little bit about his background. So tell us a little bit about how documentation factored into your life.
Well, so I kind of like the punchline of this story is that I spent 6 years being a technical writer, which I never intended to do. I went to a liberal arts college. I was always a nerdy person, but I sort of believed that you should use your, this was wrong, but that you should use your college to do something kind of impractical. And I was very committed to this. And I majored in psychology and women's studies. I was 21 or 22, and I was I need to have a job. What kind of computer thing can you do if you studied Judith Butler and not Guy Steele? And how do you move into that? And so I wrote a blog, which is kind of an anachronism, but I still do that some. And I accidentally sent out I applied for a customer support job, and signature files. There's another anachronism, but the link to my blog was in my signature file, and someone looked at it and was oh, he can write. We should hire him to be our technical writer. And then it all started, right? That's the beginning. And I moved across the country, sort of just typed. I just started writing. There was a bunch of systems administration things. I knew how Linux worked a little, or I thought I did. But in the way that you can think how something works when you're 22. And then I did that for a while. I ended up moving to New York City and got a job at a company that is now known as MongoDB as their first technical writer. Because I had been writing systems administration guides, here's how to install Apache on your SUSE or whatever. And then I started writing a bunch of documentation for them, because they needed one person to sort of tell the story. I mean, documentation isn't a story, but you need to have a bunch of different kinds of docs and sort of see the whole thing from a big picture. And there's a lot of this systems administration kind of work in systems like MongoDB. And so I could write that and I could figure things out, because and there's a lot of this being autodidactic that helped me kind of learn how to write the documentation. I certainly talked to engineers, but mostly it was open source. I just looked at the code. One of the interviews, I've given this interview a bunch of times where MongoDB has this feature where it's a very kind of simple index that deletes documents once they get older than a certain point. It's for ETL kinds of workloads where you want to expire data over time. And the way we documented that was the original implementation is less than 200 lines of C++. The CTO co-founder wrote it clearly over a weekend. We were sitting on a couch on the back of an office in Soho, and he was I'm gonna write some emails, read this code, write the documentation, and I'll look at it and tell you if it's wrong, which is nerve-wracking as hell. But I did it, apparently. And And it was actually like, I then sort of for the next basically 10 years, like had like tech writers, engineers, just like read this piece of code as a like exercise of like, here, can you take something that you have never seen before, in a language that you probably don't know, and like figure out what it's doing? Because like you can use interpretive like skills to like kind of do that. I did, and then like MongoDB became MongoDB in the way that it is today, and the documentation, like I left in like after like 4-ish years to go to sort of do other kinds of engineering work and sort of become an engineer, which has like been my career since then. But the thing, like the way that MongoDB does documentation, I think is like pretty cool, as a not just that the docs are decent, which I imagine that they are, but they sort of like continue to sort of like, it's a very lean team. They're very technical. They're not just like translating comments from code. They're like, it continues to be a very technical team. And they like think a lot about sort of documentation as this like pedagogical instrument for like teaching people about the system. And so it fulfills both the like API reference for developers, but also like what does it mean to have a distributed system as a database that's like capable of quasi-autonomous operation, and what are the things going on inside of the database, and the documentation sort of like tells you how to use it, what's possible, and like how to and how like what the procedures that you might, if you are like not just what's possible, but which is important, but also how to use it, and then like what the nouns are or the verbs are in the system that you can use to sort of do all of those things.
I think what's interesting about documentation and how it's evolved over the past decade is maybe we're moving towards a less reactive model. I mean, it's so interesting, your story about, sitting on the couch in Soho and looking at code and then creating the documentation. I wonder with tools like Copilot, if they're going to allow us to write documentation that then becomes the code, as a form of like pseudocode, right? What you want to happen, and then the code comes from there.
I have always believed that, I feel like the history of documentation is like made up of it sounds like it's going to be really poetic, and it isn't, but like made up of a lot of like, we're going to build a tool that's going to make it so that you don't have to write documentation. Is the premise of like a lot, like, and what this gives you is things like Javadoc, which are not terrible, but they're terrible. Let's just say it. Like, they're not good. And like, and they certainly do present, like, you can have a website that is produced as a result of your code comments, or your special code, your special code comments. And like, and it's so like, I've spent a number of years writing rather a lot of Go code. And Go has a much more sensible approach to the Javadoc problem, which is that it has basically none of the features and is on the whole just as useful. And so that's nice. The thing that as an engineer, so there's two things. One, I must confess that as someone who has written a lot of documentation in the past and therefore knows kind of how the sausage is made, I basically never read documentation. Like, causes, like, among other things, some amount of domestic distress. Why did you get an instruction book for this?
I mean, I love these spicy takes. So I'm curious to, I want to dig in.
I didn't think they were that spicy.
Well, I think what's interesting about it is there's been this real push to increase the amount of documentation and at least put more of a focus on it. So I'm thinking of like the DORA metrics. And so, but what I have noticed is that documentation is treated as a sort of monolith. And it's what I'm getting from you a little bit is that documentation is a little more nuanced, and that there's good and bad documentation, better and worse documentation. And then there's ways to improve that.
The wrong kind, you know.
Yeah. So I guess, do you have any insight into like what sort of documentation specifically we should be focusing on? Like what is useful? And maybe it has to do with like the audience. Like, yeah, a staff engineer has been doing this for, over a decade. Clearly you don't need it with the same way that like Stack Overflow is, typically the domain of folks who are beginning that really have these sort of questions. Is that the issue? The documentation just isn't for the type of engineer that you are, or is it? Yeah,
real personal, right? Like it might not be for me, right? Like your staff engineer who like happened to like spend 6 years writing documentation, like, and has a bunch of like analytical, like textual skills, like in like the sort of art of close reading source code,
right?
Like, which, maybe is all staff engineers, maybe isn't. So like, I'm completely willing to believe that there's like a lot of documentation that's actually sort of useful. I think like there are a lot of different kinds of APIs which require better documentation. And you can imagine, there are ways in which like programming languages which separate headers from implementation details are sort of in their own way a form of documentation, right? Like C and C++ code like kind of has this like natural separation, which lets you sort of think about documentation. I think so, but to answer your actual question, I think it matters. Audience matters so much, and user story matters so much. The thing, a thing that we don't see enough of in companies, the corporate production of software, is that we don't often have product managers. I actually like usually make this. This is an actual spicy take of like infrastructure teams need product managers because like otherwise they will build completely random things that like no one wants, but that everyone then gets stuck using. And so like maybe having a product manager to say the business goals are X and can we solve this problem, not the like. It would be really great if we had metrics of this kind or whatever the case are. But I think that's like very true of documentation, like these like basic engineering questions of like, who are our users? What are the problems that they're trying to solve? And like, how can we iterate towards that? I think the thing that I told this long story about MongoDB, and like my experience there. And I focused, as I'm wont to do, on things like building the tools and the organization and the process. But it's also probably the case. And so we can add this additional like layer here. But there's this like maybe another story where people were like, we need to tell people how to change the size of their like replication operation log or op log. And this was like, like there was an engineer who wrote a blog post that everyone used. And I just like lifted it in because it was like correct and she was good and so and it's like a kind of crazy procedure, and it's still like I found it a couple days ago a few weeks ago, because it's kind of actually like stop your node and start it in this new node and then run this very specific query and then start it up again and things will be okay. And it's kind of nuts. And I think that one of the things that we did is we sort of saw the kinds of questions that people needed. We saw what support teams were like. We need a procedure to tell people how to help to solve this problem. And so we were able to kind of like address those needs. And so the thing that I like definitely that was absolutely happening is that those like user stories and business cases for like, how do we want people to use the documentation, were things that were going on around me. And I was sort of like focused on typing really fast or focused on building the tools. And this is a thing that like, I think happens to all sorts of engineers, including technical writers, is that you get focused on that. And it's really hard to sort of say like, okay, like take the step back and say, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the business goals? Who are the users? What's the thing that's most painful for them? And it's so hard to do that because it requires a completely different perspective and like way of thinking about your work. You can't really sort of be like, okay, what's the procedure that everyone needs to know about? I'm also going to go write this completely different tool to like do recursive, composition of documentation things. Like there's just like very different things. And that switch is like going from one to the other is like very hard. And so I think that like having teams would be well served by having someone to sort of focus them from a product perspective. And this is the spicy take, is that there is this now 30-year-old sort of idea that that things like wikis will democratize the documentation process. And what they actually do, I think, is diffuse responsibility for documentation. And so in some ways, like, while we need better tooling, we need tooling that supports ownership, not tooling that diffuses ownership. And so I think I actually think that in some that it's kind of good that Google Docs killed the wiki or the enterprise wiki, and like who knows what Notion's going to do, how they're going to come out of this. But the enterprise wiki really sort of like, to my mind, was a failure because you need like people to manage to like own that sort of thing, and no one ever did in any or ever. And I think that I think that was like a definite dip in the like documentation like world, was that there's this period of time when like everyone was like, oh, we're not going to hire technical writers, we're going to just have a wiki and everyone's going to edit it and it's going to be great. And you're like, no. And like, if we can figure out a way of like building tools that support people and owners and owners of documentation, then like there is, and without sort of like these like magic snake oil type, like and then you won't have to worry about documentation. Like you will still need someone to like care about it. Like you need someone to care about it, or else it's not going to be good.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the way that I'm hearing what you're saying is that documentation is relationships, that it becomes, that it's about the people, it's about the structure of the organization, that there's a leadership element, and that there's, that they can't just be these static sort of things living in their wikis. When I was doing front end, we would have document-a-paloozas, order pizza, and everyone on the engineering team would get in a room together and update our wiki. And my God, we couldn't get it done, in a day. We got a few done. But it was kind of gestures toward that the need to have everybody in the room looking at this, and that, trying to jam it into, a quarterly event is just not going to work, especially because trying to get an entire engineering team together was just impossible.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways in which like that kind of engineer, like that's just like not, I'm sorry for you, but I've also watched teams have similar sorts of approaches to the like, let's all fix flaky tests on Friday, or all like like you like when that's actually, so there are a number of things that I watch engineering organizations do. The rotation, it will be someone's job to be miserable once a month, or the party approach of like, let's all do it all, like we'll spend a week all together, and so we'll all be miserable. Or these are all sort of symptoms of we didn't hire we did not hire the right person to do the job that we think is valuable, but not so valuable that we're willing to pay for it. And the truth is that like taking your entire engineering team for a week for like I don't know how big it was, but that's enough to hire 2 technical writers.
That's a good point.
And engineers do a lot of are ironically really bad at these cost benefit analyses about hiring more people. Just hire 2 technical writers, and you'll save money. It's worth it. I think there are ways to intelligent and so in some ways documentation is one of the things that you use to solve this intelligibility of code problem. And I think that but it's a solution and not and we should keep asking ourselves the question, how do we make this, how do we solve this problem of I am an intern and I want to be able to make a meaningful contribution to this code base inside of 10 weeks or 12 weeks or however long the program is. And that's a problem which is a little bit on how do we scope intern projects, and some of it's on how do we keep our code base well organized and not with crazy legacy names.
So it's interesting because I do think of documentation as being this the thing that comes out of brownfield projects, that we have to write all of these exceptions and these reasons that things don't work right, or whatever plugin is breaking, and that's why we need to make a note that if you're doing this, in order to get it up locally, you have to turn this off, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
The greenfield it seems like that's what you're aspiring to a little bit, or at least polished.
Yeah, I mean, but I think you can add polish to systems, and I don't mean to sort of say that you never write documentation, but that, and because obviously you need to, and comments are definitely you definitely do want to add comments of there's dragons here, know that there are dragons, and
yes,
but aspiring to sometimes you fix problems by fixing problems, but sometimes you fix them by making them not be problems. And there's and depending on which layer you're working at or what the constraints are, those are options. So certainly interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a good time for us to wrap up. So I want to thank Sam for coming on the Docs Are In today. I've learned a lot. I like that it went from being tell me why docs are great to maybe do we need docs at all? Maybe there's a better way. not what I anticipated. So Sam, would you like to tell us where folks can find more information? Hear more of your spicy and hot takes.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm on Twitter and Tychoish, TYCHOISH, and the same.com, tychoish.com, are great. Both there.
All right, I'll put that in the notes. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And with that, the docs are out.